1968 was a year of chaos and conflict in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy assassinated. Riots engulfing our cities. The escalating war in Vietnam, claiming LBJ's presidency and alienating millions of Americans. Against this turbulent backdrop, NASA resumed its manned flights and aimed to test in space the craft that it hoped to land on the moon before year's end. A sudden change of plans turned Apollo 8 into another make-or-break mission.
Apollo 8 was not going to be a lunar flight. Apollo 8 was going to be an Earth orbital flight to test the lunar module in Earth orbit to make sure that everything was correct for the two vehicles before we'd ever commit them to go to the moon.
Apollo 8 was a big step forward, though even if successful, America would still be trailing the Russians in the race to the moon.
The Soviets had sent a spacecraft around the moon with animals to test whether they could send cosmonauts and tried to beat us, not for a landing, but at least beat us to go around the moon. And they were fairly successful. But then in the Soviet hierarchy, they had a big controversy. Should we send the cosmonauts? And the other people said, no, we ought to send them one more time just to make sure.
The CIA began getting signals that maybe the Soviets were going to try a circumlunar flight, just a big figure eight around the moon, which would have massively undercut the PR potential of a lunar landing or even, a lunar orbital flight.
To make matters worse for NASA, the lunar module wasn't ready to go into space. It was months behind schedule. But instead of falling further behind the Soviets, NASA officials hatched a bold idea.
The lunar module, unfortunately, was delayed considerably. And so NASA, again, in one of the great strokes of management, substituted Apollo 8 from an Earth orbital flight to a lunar orbital flight.
If it worked, America would actually leapfrog the Soviets in the space race. An astronaut, not a cosmonaut, would be the first to fly around the moon.
I think was one of the big gambles that NASA, at the direction of the president, took in order to establish that America was better than the Soviet Union.
A big gamble indeed. After all, it was less than 2 years before that Apollo 1 demonstrated just how complex every mission was, how the smallest oversight could be fatal. Nobody knew that better than Frank Borman, point man in the Apollo 1 investigation. NASA tapped him to command this latest mission.
I was called back, will you volunteer to take Apollo 8 to the moon? I said, yes, we would be happy to. We found out that we would be going to the moon in August of 1968.
We were sort of at the last minute, just several months before we were scheduled to launch, but that's what we're being asked to do, so ours was not the reason why, ours was but to do or die.
Do or die, not just for the three astronauts. If the Annus Horribilis, that was 1968, ended with a space disaster, it could end America's lunar quest for good.
It certainly occurred to me that if the flight wasn't successful, we'd be a monument to America's failure.
On December 21st, Apollo 8 launched from Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
We have liftoff.
Just over 2.5 hours later, the crew was given permission to become the first humans to leave Earth orbit.
We go for TLS.
Using a state-of-the-art computer which had 1/13 the memory of a modern calculator, Jim Lovell fired the launcher's third stage and sent their craft hurling on its 3-day journey to the moon.
What does the old moon look like? The moon is essentially gray, no color.
As we came into Earthrise, we were shocked, dumbfounded almost, to see this Earth coming up. We hadn't seen it before. We weren't briefed about it, and so there was a scramble for cameras.
On Christmas Eve, while orbiting the moon, this picture titled Earthrise was photographed by Bill Anders. This shot has become one of the most reproduced space photographs in history.
It was the only thing in space that had any color. Everything else was black and white. The Earth was blue with white clouds and brownish pink continents. And we were a long way from home, and it was Christmas. That was a very nostalgic moment. To me, I think Bill Anders said it best. He said, we came all the way to the moon, and what really perked our interest was the Earth.
I vaguely remember that, so if somebody wants to credit with me, I'll take the credit.
Many of the men and later women who have been in space, they're so mesmerized by what they see. There are no boundaries, there are no lines between countries.
It gives you more of a actual true perspective of our existence on Earth. Because you look back at the Earth and look how small it is and how you could, cover it up with your thumb. And you realize we were so fortunate to have a body that was in the proper position from the sun with the proper mass and everything to allow life to begin.
With the world engrossed in Apollo 8's epic journey, the astronauts marked the holiday season by taking turns reading from the Old Testament.
God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth.
Old Testament is really the basis of many of the world's religions, not just Christian. And so it affected most of the people that would be listening to us. And so we thought that was very appropriate.
Lovell also relayed a sighting that delighted children worldwide.
Please be informed there is a Santa Claus. That's a Sunday. He is the best one to know.
Did your family just delay the Christmas celebration for after you came back?
Well, partly, but I planned ahead of time and gave my wife a present that essentially the card said, "From the man on the moon." So,
To show all us guys up. Apollo 8 showed everyone up, certainly the Soviets. But while America was now leading the space race, the end of the decade and JFK's deadline was quickly approaching. Coming up, there was only one giant step left to take on the pathway to the moon, and it would mark an epic moment in human history. After this.